I was born, said Prokofiev, in the village of Santsovska, in the Dnipropetrovsk region at 5 p.m. on Wednesday, April the 11th, 1891. My father was manager of a huge estate in the steppes belonging to the Zonson family. My mother played the piano, which gave me a taste for serious music from early childhood, and at night I often fell asleep to the sounds of a Beethoven sonata being played by my mother 4 rooms away from mine. It is to his mother that Prokofiev owed his early musical training. Every day he would join her at the piano, playing scales and exercises and copying anything that took his fancy. When he was 8 years old, he went to Moscow to see Borodin's Prince Igor. It excited the boy so much that he went home and wrote 2 full-length operas of his own. He was 9 years old. News of this extraordinary talent reached Glatsunov, the composer, who urged his mother to bring the boy to study at his conservatoire in St. Petersburg. In 1904, Prokofiev wrote, when I was 13, my mother took me to St. Petersburg to enter the conservatoire. I took with me 2 huge folders containing 4 operas, a symphony, 2 sonatas, and a good many piano pieces. Thus started 10 years of rapid development of an original and rebellious talent, 10 years of ceaseless, stubborn struggle with his professors for the assertion of a totally individual style.
Это же невероятно. Это ужасно. Это ужасно. Ну, что же скажет публика? Публика скажет, что виноваты учителя, а учителя ничего не могут поделать с вами. Дорогой мой, это же кошачий концерт. Ну, делайте, что хотите. Я ничего вам могу сделать. Бог с вами, делайте, что хотите.
I graduated, he said, in 1914, at the age of 23. The poor marks I got for composition made me determined to win the Rubinstein Prize, a grand piano. I thought it would be difficult to compete successfully playing one of the classics, but that if I played my own work, the examiners simply wouldn't be able to judge whether I was playing well or not. So I had my concerto printed and distributed. When I came onto the stage, the first thing I saw was my own concerto spread out on 20 laps, an unforgettable sight for a composer who had just begun to appear in print. This was the work which made Prokofiev's name. It was a work kicking against tradition, the work of a rebel. At the same time, it could not be ignored. Opinion was naturally divided. Some of the judges felt that it was a scandal, that he should be kicked out of the hall. Others, that he should be awarded 100 grand pianos. Glatsunov, the director of the conservatoire, found the music intolerable and voted against it, but in the end had to announce, against his will, that the jury had found Prokofiev the winner. Prokofiev was toppling the musical giants of his day. Success followed upon success, and he soon found himself the toast of St. Petersburg and the talk of the musical world. On January the 16th, he said, 1916, I conducted the premiere of my Scythian suite. The whole musical elite of St. Petersburg went along, and it caused almost as much of a scandal as my second piano concerto had done. Glazunov, whom I had personally invited, lost his temper again, and unable to endure my sunrise finale, started walking out 8 bars before the end. While Prokofiev was taken up with his own musical revolution, the great political revolution of 1917 was approaching. It meant little to Prokofiev, who worked on a violin concerto at the very time when Lenin was preparing to strike. When the fighting broke out in St. Petersburg, Prokofiev was present as a spectator but remained inwardly unmoved. He retired to the country and started work on his classical symphony. While history was being made in St. Petersburg, Prokofiev worked on the last movement. After the symphony was finished, he said, I was left with nothing to do and time hung heavily on my hands. I had no idea of the scope of the revolution. It never occurred to me that, like any other citizen, I might be of use to it. And hence, the idea of going to America took root in my mind. In vain did one wise friend warn me, you are running away from history and history will never forgive you. I paid no attention to these words, and on May the 7th, 1918, I set out on my journey. He arrived in America and composed The Love of Three Oranges for the Chicago Opera House. He was 26. He came to London, conducted his buffoon ballet, and gave brilliant recitals. He went to Paris and took it by storm. Diaghilev, the Russian ballet impresario, championed him. His Russian ballet was new and exotic and had started a cult for everything Russian in Paris, from parties to clothes. Prokofiev was carried along on the top of the Russian wave, going from success to success. And success was glittering in the frenzied, sensational Paris of the 1920s. He was the latest craze. But Stravinsky, another émigré composer, appeared on the scene to block Prokofiev's progress. Favorite with Diaghilev again, as he had been years before, and with the fickle Parisian public, Stravinsky ousted his compatriot. Prokofiev was suddenly out of favor, and the rest of his years of wandering about in Europe and in America were largely spent in trying to get back into fashion. His music, according to his own account, became more and more arid and incomprehensible. For the time being, he was finished. But he wasn't the man to lie down under it. He decided to go back to Russia. This was, he thought, where he really belonged. I must, he said, I must have a real Russian winter and people who sing the same songs as I do. The Russia he returned to was a new country. The musical idiom he wrote at this time, in which one could speak of Soviet life, was not yet clear to me. It was clear to no one at this period, and I did not want to make a mistake. Hence, I was much pleased when asked to write music for Soviet films. It gave me a welcome opportunity to try my hand, if not at Soviet subject matter, then at music for Soviet audiences, and mass audiences at that. The result of his homecoming was that the empty and tortured music of his last days in Europe yielded to an apparently effortless flow of melody. It was as if returning home had given him a new release of energy. His greatest creation at this time was undoubtedly Romeo and Juliet, which, written in 1934 as a full-length three-act ballet, has not been surpassed to this day, either in Russia or anywhere else. Prokofiev's new simplicity satisfied both himself and his vast new musical public and established him at once as the Soviet Union's greatest composer. The works continued to pour out. His score for the film Alexander Nevsky, which told of Russia's 13th century struggle to overthrow the invading German knights, lifted film music right out of the background and for the first time made the music part of the film itself. In the following year, 1939, Prokofiev expanded this work into a dramatic cantata, which, with its songs of suffering, defiance, and belief in ultimate victory over the German invader, became one of the great patriotic pieces of music which helped carry the Soviet Union through the war. From 1941, Prokofiev may have been writing music to order, but it was music that came from the heart. Like everybody else, he wanted to win the war, to cry defiance. He did it with music. For outstanding service to his country, Prokofiev was decorated with all sorts of titles and awards. His music became known and revered throughout the whole country. With the coming of peace, the USSR started to recover. The fountains played once more in Leningrad. The war won, Prokofiev turned his attention away from glory and the clash of arms. He started work on a sixth symphony. It expressed a personal and even private point of view. The great cry in Russia in 1947 was for what was called creative optimism. Prokofiev's new symphony cut right across this public mood, and they didn't like it. Its idiom and tone seemed to have absolutely nothing in common with what was going on. In the event, this Sixth Symphony was banned, and there were others. A public performance of a sonata was cancelled at the last moment without explanation. There was danger in the air. The musical world waited for something to happen. Something did.
Товарищи, если вы дорожите высоким званием советского композитора, вы должны доказать...
In January 1948, a conference of musicians and composers was called in the building of the Central Committee of the Communist Party under the chairmanship of Zhdanov, the party's spokesman for cultural reforms. Several prominent Soviet musicians were denounced, Prokofiev, the country's leading composer, most of all. Prokofiev's music, Zhdanov said, reflected decadent Western influences. It was atonal, dissonant, and disharmonious. It was marred by formalistic perversions and anti-democratic tendencies. His influence on young musicians was disastrous. His music was degenerate, anti-realist, modernist, false, ugly, and idealistic. It was unintelligible to the people and unwanted by the people. All the musicians and composers denounced, admitted their faults, recanting publicly or on paper, but not Prokofiev. He had behaved characteristically at the meeting. It said that he had sat on a piano stool throughout with his back to Zhdanov. A month later, he was summoned to a further meeting, refused to go, and instead wrote a letter in which he said, "I consider melody by far the most important element in music, but one must be particularly vigilant to make a melody simple without allowing it to become cheap, sickly, or imitative rubbish." All the same, he tried. He would write an opera, he announced, called The Story of a Real Man, based on the life of a heroic fighter pilot. It would contain simple harmonies and much folk song material. The opera was given a closed performance at the Bolshoi. Krenikov, a jumped-up minor composer now in the seat of power, announced the party's verdict.
Антимелодичная и модернистская.
Prokofiev heard his work dismissed as being anti-melodious and modernist.
В ней отсутствует подлинное понимание советского героизма и советской человечности.
He was told that he was lacking in real understanding of Soviet heroism and Soviet humanity. Prokofiev did his best. He went to endless pains to write huge works commemorating events like the rebuilding of Moscow. The works failed to satisfy the powers that be, and they failed to satisfy anyone else either. They were enormous, contrived, and somehow wooden. As so long ago in Paris, he had tried hard to satisfy a fickle demand for new musical sensations, so now he tried and failed to satisfy a demand for music as propaganda. It was the lowest point of his life. It culminated in an orchestral poem he wrote in honor of the opening of the Volga-Don Canal. The music pleased no one at the time and has pleased no one since. By this time, Prokofiev, approaching his 60s, was living in the country outside Moscow. Officially, he was in disrepute. His first wife had been deported by the party to a camp in the far north, and he was a very sick man. And once more, it was the last time he began the slow climb back. But now it was a battle which he wasn't to win until after his death. He had fought against his professors long ago. He had turned his back on Europe. Now he ignored the party. He dropped all attempts at official music and once more simply wrote the music he wanted to write. He was ill, but lived another 3 years. And then, 10 years after his death, his music was played everywhere. The symphony, which had been banned, was hailed and enjoyed. The victory was his. In all this, he had never really strayed far from his central idea. Composing, he wrote, is like shooting at a moving target. Only by aiming ahead at tomorrow will you avoid being left behind at the level of yesterday's needs. I have striven for clarity and melodiousness. At the same time, I have scrupulously avoided palming off familiar harmonies and tunes. That is where the difficulty of composing clean, straightforward music lies. The clarity must be new, not old. And so, new and ironic, music poured out of him, an authentic and personal vision which had been there for all his ups and downs from the beginning, and which remained with him until the end. His death went by quite unnoticed. Stalin died the same day. It was March 1953. Prokofiev was 61 years old.